Walk the old rail bed out of the Satsop Hills far enough, and the trees open up without warning, and there it is, a steel arch bridge, 347 feet tall, standing over a canyon with no track left on it, and no train that's crossed it in 50 years. Nobody built it to be a monument. It was built to move logs. The logs stopped coming, and nobody ever came back to take it down. That bridge isn't a ruin. It's structurally sound, National Register listed, and it will probably outlast most of what's currently standing in downtown Seattle. It's just finished with the only job it was ever given. Washington did this more than 100 times. A town would grow around it fast enough to have a name, a school, a post office, and then, on a schedule nobody controlled, the accessible timber would run out and the company would leave. Some towns rotted quietly. One was evacuated and set on fire by the same company that built it. And one, right at the very end of this list, didn't die at all. It just changed owners, and the loggers were replaced by retirees living in the exact same houses. We're walking through 12 of them, not the postcard version, the ones with a real structure or a real photograph still on record, so you're seeing something that actually exists. Number 12, Kerriston, King County. The town reduced to a potbelly stove in the woods. South of Rattlesnake Mountain, along the raging river in King County, there's a stretch of second-growth forest that used to be a functioning company town, and almost nobody who drives past on the nearby roads knows it. Kerriston grew up the way most Pacific Northwest logging towns did. A mill, worker housing, the basic infrastructure to keep a workforce fed and sheltered while they cut through the surrounding timber. Business held for a couple of decades. Then it didn't. The mill's activity declined, the company pulled out, and the town was left where it stood. Today, the site is reachable by an old logging road that's become a hiking trail. What's left isn't dramatic. No standing walls, no roofline against the sky. It's scattered artifacts pressed into the forest floor. Bricks, rusted metal drums, and, somewhat famously among the people who make the hike, a large cast-iron pot-belly stove sitting alone where a building used to be around it. The raging river still runs past the site exactly like it did when this was a working town, indifferent to the fact that the town is gone. Number 11, Barneston, King County. The town Seattle evicted to protect its drinking water. Barneston sat inside the Cedar River watershed, southeast of Seattle, built up in the logging boom of the early 1900s to supply lumber for a city that was growing faster than almost anywhere else on the West Coast. It had homes, a mill, and workers who spent their days cutting the timber that would end up as somebody else's floorboards in Seattle. The problem was the water underneath all that timber. The Cedar River watershed was also Seattle's primary drinking water source, and by the 1920s, city officials had decided that human habitation and logging activity inside a drinking water supply zone was a public health risk they weren't willing to keep taking. In 1924, the city of Seattle disallowed human habitation within the watershed boundary entirely. Barneston's residents didn't get a slow decline. They got an eviction notice with a legal reason behind it, and the town emptied out. What's left today is mill foundations and scattered debris, reachable via forest trails that follow the old logging grades. The watershed restriction that ended Barneston is, in a strange way, still protecting the site from redevelopment today. The same rule that killed the town keeps it quiet. Number 10. Nagrom, King County, the company town. Named by spelling the boss's name backward. In 1911, the Morgan Lumber Company built a sawmill along the Green River in King County and needed a name for the settlement growing up around it. Somebody in the company office spelled Morgan backward. Nagrom stuck. At its peak, Nagrom had homes, a functioning mill, and a schoolhouse serving the families of dozens of logging crews. It ran on the same clock every Pacific Northwest timber town ran on. Cut the accessible old growth, ship it out, expand the operation further into the hills until the terrain or the economics stopped making sense. When the timber thinned and the mill's operations wound down, the town went the way most company towns do. Quietly, without much fanfare, workers moving on to the next operation, buildings left to the forest. What remains today are scattered foundations along the Green River corridor, some still visible from nearby trails, a quiet reminder that somebody once thought spelling their own last name backward was a good enough reason to build a town. Number 9. Melmont, Pierce County. The swimming pool, nobody expected to survive. East of Carbonado, along an abandoned rail grade that's now a 6-mile round-trip hiking trail, the ruins of Melmont sit scattered through second-growth forest near Mount Rainier National Park's western approach. Melmont was a company town serving the logging and coal operations of Pierce County in the early 1900s, built along a rail line that hauled both timber and coal out of the surrounding hills. Like most single-industry towns of the era, its lifespan was tied directly to the resource underneath it. Once the accessible coal seams and timber stands were worked out, there was no economic reason to keep the town running, and it was abandoned in the early 1920s. What makes Melmont worth the hike is what the forest left behind. Old wagon bridge abutments still stand over the creek. The foundation of the school basement is still visible, sunk into the undergrowth. Rusting vehicles from decades of slow abandonment sit half-swallowed by blackberry bushes and second-growth fir. Much of the original schoolhouse lumber was actually salvaged decades ago and reused to build a nearby family ranch home. So pieces of Melmont are technically still standing, just somewhere else, under a different roof. Number 8. Claquato, Lewis County, the county seat the railroad erased. In the 1850s, under the leadership of a settler named Hawkins Davis, Claquato became a genuine boomtown, the seat of Lewis County, a hub for the region's lumber trade, growing fast enough that its future seemed guaranteed. Davis himself died in a fall at the mill he'd built, but the town he'd started kept growing without him for a while. Then, about a decade later, the railroad chose a different route. It bypassed Claquato entirely in favor of a nearby settlement, and without rail access, there was no way for Claquato's lumber to compete. The town's decline wasn't dramatic. No fire, no flood, just a slow bleed of businesses and residents relocating to wherever the trains actually stopped. By 1902, Claquato had been formally removed from the county records. It stopped existing on paper, the same way it had already stopped existing in practice. What survives is genuinely remarkable for a town this old, the Claquato Church, built in the 1850s, restored in the 1950s, and added to the National Register of Historic Places, Washington's oldest standing church, still holding its original bell and a distinctive crown of thorns steeple. Nearby, the old cemetery holds a famous fir tree that once sheltered pioneer travelers passing through. 2 landmarks and an entire county seat's worth of history underneath them. Number 7. Pysht, Clallam County, the town built to grow wings for World War I. On the Olympic Peninsula, near the mouth of the Pysht River on the Strait of Juan de Fuca, a Clallam village had existed for generations before any European settlers arrived. That fact matters to how this story ends. American homesteaders arrived in the 1880s, but the area stayed sparsely developed until World War I created an unusual kind of demand. The U.S. military needed enormous quantities of Sitka spruce, prized for its strength-to-weight ratio, to build the wooden airframes of fighter planes. The Michigan-based Merrill and Ring Company moved in, bought up homesteads, and built a full company town at Pysht to feed that demand. At its height, the town housed roughly 500 people, with a post office, company store, schoolhouse, hospital, electric plant, and its own movie hall. Here's the part of the story that doesn't make it into most tourist write-ups. In the 1920s, while the residents of the neighboring Clallam village were away working elsewhere, loggers demolished the village to make room for a lumber mill. It's a detail that's easy to skip past in a list of ghost towns, but it's part of the record, and it belongs in the story. The logging boom that built Pysht didn't outlast the war it was built for. Today, the site functions as a working tree farm. The company's original office building is still standing and still in use, along with a superintendent's house, a guest house, and several workmen's cabins, all preserved as working structures rather than ruins. Number 6. Vance/Malone, Mason County, the bridge that outlived everything it was built to serve. In the Satsop Hills of Mason County, an arch bridge rises 347 feet above a forested gorge, spanning 422 feet across at its widest point. When the Simpson Logging Company finished building it in 1929, it was the second highest railway trestle ever constructed in the United States, engineered without scaffolding, using cantilever methods and cableways to cross a canyon that had no other practical way through. The bridge served an 80-mile logging railroad network hauling timber out of the Olympic Peninsula to Simpson's Mill in Shelton. Nearby, camps like the Vance Lumber Company's operation near Malone housed the crews who fed logs onto that rail line. full working camps with bunkhouses, mess halls, and rolling stock, captured in dozens of surviving period photographs from logging-era archivists. By the 1970s, trucks had replaced rail as the standard for moving logs out of the mountains, and the bridge was decommissioned. The rails and much of the deck were removed, leaving a skeletal steel arch standing alone over the gorge, structurally sound but serving nothing. It's listed on the National Register of Historic Places, reachable by a multi-mile hike along the old railbed, and it remains one of the most photographed abandoned structures in the entire Pacific Northwest. A bridge built to outlast the industry that built it, and it did. Number 5. Selleck, King County, the company town that survived its own company. In 1908, the Pacific States Lumber Company built Selleck along the foothills of southeast King County, and for the better part of 3 decades it was one of the more remarkable company towns in the state, not because of what it produced, but because of who it employed. Selleck's mill required a large, steady workforce, and the company recruited broadly, including Japanese laborers who came to the town in significant numbers following the devastating 1923 Tokyo earthquake. At its peak in 1916, nearly 900 people lived in Selleck, supported by a hospital, hotels, and weekly community dances. The town also built the world's highest railway trestle at the time it opened, stretching 204 feet above the Cedar River, a smaller but no less audacious cousin of the bridge in Mason County. When the lumber operation wound down through the 1930s and 40s, most Selleck-style company towns simply emptied and rotted. Selleck didn't. A cluster of the original bungalow-style worker housing survived, preserved well enough to be recognized as a King County landmark today. It's one of the few places on this list where you can see, in standing wood frame buildings rather than foundations, exactly what a 1910s Pacific Northwest timber town actually looked like to live in. Number 4. Alpine, King County, the immigrant railway town the company burned on purpose. 8 miles west of Stevens Pass in the Cascade Mountains, reachable only by rail and a mile from the nearest road, a settlement existed under 2 different names and 2 different identities before it disappeared entirely. It started as Nippon, built in the late 1800s specifically to house Japanese railway workers constructing the Great Northern Line through Stevens Pass. A nearby settlement called Korea housed Korean workers doing the same labor. In 1910, a sawmill went up, and the site became a genuine lumber town, its buildings built with steeply pitched roofs in a style locals compared to Swiss chalets, suited to the heavy mountain snow. In 1903, the local lumber baron who now controlled the settlement renamed it Alpine, and the Nippon Lumber Company eventually followed suit, becoming the Alpine Lumber Company by 1920. At its peak, Alpine held 200 to 300 residents, entirely dependent on rail access and entirely dependent on the surrounding timber. By the late 1920s, the accessible timber was gone. Rather than leave the building standing for scavengers or slow decay, the company evacuated the remaining residents and intentionally burned the town to the ground around 1929. Today, 7 building foundations are all that remain, hidden beneath vegetation in what's now genuinely difficult terrain to reach without a rail line. It's one of the few ghost towns on this list that didn't die slowly. It was deliberately erased in a single act, its entire physical record reduced to ash on purpose. Number 3. Bordeaux, Thurston County, the ghost town with no grudge. Just west of the Mima Mounds in Thurston County, along the banks of Mima Creek, brick walls and bridge footings sit in the woods where one of the longest-lived company towns in the Pacific Northwest used to operate at full capacity. Brothers Thomas and Joseph Bordeaux built their timber operation in the Black Hills starting in the 1880s, and by the early 1900s, their Mason County Logging Company and the affiliated Mumby Lumber and Shingle Company had built Bordeaux into a genuine town. A post office by 1903, a hotel, a school, and neighborhoods on the hillside above the industrial core. At its 1920s peak, roughly 600,000 board feet of lumber a day moved out on the company's own 85-mile logging railroad, the Black Hills and Northwestern. The end came in 1941, when the old-growth timber that had fueled 3 decades of operations was simply gone. The mills closed. What's remembered most about Bordeaux's closure isn't bitterness. A contemporary newspaper account quoted departing workers as having no grudge against the company, understanding plainly that it takes logs to run a mill, and the logs were gone. It's an unusually calm ending for an industry defined by boom and bust collapse. Today, Crumbling brick walls, an old basement, bridge footings, and a single surviving house are what remain along Mima Creek. Quiet, accessible, and, according to more than one visitor, unusually beautiful for a ghost town. Number 2. Leicester, King County, the ghost town that didn't finish dying until this century. Most of the towns on this list ended decades ago. Leicester didn't finish disappearing until 2003. Founded around 1891 or 1892 along the western slopes of Stampede Pass, Leicester started as a railroad town supporting steam locomotives hauling both freight and timber over one of the steepest grades in the Cascades, a 6-stall roundhouse and heavy Baldwin-built locomotives working a 5.6% grade that pushed the limits of what steam power could handle. Logging and railroading grew up side by side here for most of the 20th century, and unlike most of the towns on this list, Leicester didn't die when the timber ran out. It kept a small population and a functioning rail stop for decades after the surrounding logging operations had wound down. What finally killed Leicester wasn't the forest running out. It was infrastructure. As highway routes were rerouted around the town and the rail traffic that had sustained it for over a century declined toward nothing, the remaining residents left one by one, and the settlement was fully abandoned by 2003, recent enough that some of the people who grew up there are still alive to talk about it. Cabins in the old depot structure remain standing today, aging in real time rather than sitting as century-old ruins, which makes Leicester one of the more unsettling entries on this list. It doesn't look like history. It looks like somewhere that just closed. Number 1. Ryderwood, Cowlitz County. The logging town that never actually died. It was just replaced. Every town on this list ended the way logging towns are supposed to end. The timber ran out, the company left, and the forest took the buildings back. Ryderwood is the one exception, and it's the reason we saved it for last. In 1923, the Long Bell Lumber Company built Ryderwood from the ground up at a cost of $1.5 million. At the time, the largest community ever constructed entirely with private funds. It was deliberately different from a standard logging camp. Instead of bunkhouses for single men, Long Bell built a genuine family town, real houses, a school, a church, a theater, a hospital, a hotel, all built simultaneously with its sister city Longview, which existed purely to mill the lumber Ryderwood's crews were cutting. For a while, it billed itself, without much competition, as the world's largest logging town. Then, by 1953, logging methods had changed, and the old growth stands that had justified the entire operation were gone. Long Bell didn't burn the town or walk away from it. They sold it, for $96,000, to a company called Senior Estates, Inc., whose plan was to turn the entire logging town into a retirement community for people 55 and older. It worked. The loggers and their families left. Retirees moved into the same houses, the same school building, the same church. In 1955, residents built a 6-acre lake out of an old gravel pit. The community hall got remodeled. The theater kept operating, just for a different audience. Today, Ryderwood still exists, not as ruins, not as foundations in a forest, but as a functioning town of a few hundred people, most of them retired, living inside the physical shell of a logging operation that no longer exists in any other form. The forest didn't swallow Ryderwood. The industry vanished overnight, and something else simply moved into the space it left behind, wearing the same buildings, walking the same streets. It might be the strangest ending on this entire list, a ghost town where the ghosts are the loggers, and the town itself just kept going without them. Here's what stays strange about Ryderwood, if you think about it standing in the street there today. The theater still runs movies. The church still holds services. Somebody is probably mowing a lawn right now in front of a house built in 1923 for a family who cut timber for a living, and the person mowing it has never touched a chainsaw in their life. Nothing was torn down, nothing burned. The entire population of a company town simply left over a couple of years, and an entirely different population walked in behind them and kept the lights on. That's the part Washington's timber ghost towns keep circling back to, one way or another. Barneston didn't get worn down by weather. A city council vote ended it in an afternoon. Alpine didn't fade. A company lit a match. Bordeaux's workers left without hard feelings, because they understood exactly why it had to end. These places didn't run out of luck. They ran out of trees, and the ending arrived on a schedule that somebody, somewhere, could always see coming. Somewhere in Washington right now, A working logging town is operating on exactly that same schedule, and doesn't know it yet. Tell me which of these 12 you'd actually go stand in front of, and if you want the deeper cut, the ones that need an actual bushwhack to reach, say so below.